I've been stationed out here at the Adak Island NOAA weather station since early June, and I'm telling you, no amount of training or isolation prep could have gotten me ready for what I saw last week. I almost don't even know where to begin, but I'll give you every detail I can recall because it's been rattling around in my head nonstop. It was late, closer to midnight, on August 23rd, and I was the only one on site because my colleague had flown to Anchorage for some supply logistics. Remote weather stations are lonely under normal conditions, but when a storm is rolling in off the Bering Sea, the wind echoes against every metal surface out here, and the whole building vibrates in a way that makes your skin prickle. Anyway, I was manning the instruments, running a routine check on our anemometer calibration. The wind had started gusting beyond 50 knots, easily. We get storms out here all the time. Adak is notorious for some of the worst weather in Alaska, so normally I just note the data, secure some of the exterior hatches, maybe double-check the diesel generator. But for some reason I felt on edge that evening. The barometric pressure was dropping unusually fast, almost like the microburst storms you see in the Gulf around hurricane season, but it's not typical up here in August. I was about to log the changes into our system when all the exterior motion alarms started pinging one after another across the console. Normally, that might indicate debris or a large bird hitting the sensor, and we do get big seabirds around here, albatross, gulls, the occasional bald eagle. But the motion sensors triggered in a pattern that was too deliberate, around the perimeter in a sweeping arc, not just one side or angle. I remember cursing softly under my breath because my first concern was the new Doppler device we'd just installed on the roof. I put on my thermal coat and stepped outside. The building's floodlights were cutting through the horizontal rain in that hazy, swirling way where you can't see more than 10 feet ahead of you. The wind had an absolutely raw chill. Honestly, it's not unusual to feel claustrophobic under that thick cloud cover here, especially during a storm. But there was something else, like the air was heavier. I swung my flashlight around, half expecting to see a chunk of metal siding that had come loose, or a big gull flapping around. That's when I caught a glimpse of what looked like a pair of massive wings passing through the floodlight beam overhead. At first I thought it was a trick of the water droplets on the lens of my glasses, so I wiped them and tried to get a better look. Then the station's southern perimeter light flickered, and in that brief flash, I could see this hulking shape circling above, maybe 25 or 30 feet up. It was definitely bigger than any eagle or condor I've ever seen. I can't claim to be a wildlife biologist, but I've been out in the field for years, spent time in the Rockies, the Appalachians, the outskirts of the Brooks Range. I've seen big birds, but nothing like this. It seemed to hover for a moment in the swirl of the storm, and then it dipped just low enough that I could make out elongated limbs. The wingspan had to be at least 12 or 15 feet across. I found myself shaking so badly, I almost dropped my flashlight. The wind was whipping around me, so at first I thought I heard some distorted echo of it, but it almost sounded like a low moan or hum, not like a bird's screech or the wind through the station's scaffolding. And the shape, this is the part that still makes my stomach knot. It wasn't just an animal. It looked more like a tall, hunched figure, with wings attached where arms might have been. I've never seen a silhouette like that. The color or texture of it was dark, maybe gray or black, but the light conditions were so poor it's hard to be certain. I probably stood there for a good minute, though it felt like an eternity, looking up at this thing while the rain pelted my face. At one point, I swear it angled its head in my direction, like it registered I was there. That was the absolute worst moment, realizing it was aware of me. My heart started pounding so violently that I thought I might pass out. I didn't even realize I was backing away until I collided with the grated stair behind me. I had to force myself to go around and check the roof access door, because we'd had issues with it jamming. The entire time I was walking along the narrow walkway that encircles the station, I felt like that thing could swoop down at any second. Every time I peered into the night sky, the lightning would flicker in the distance and illuminate pockets of cloud, but I kept seeing that shape weaving in and out of the darkness. It was as if it was using the storm's chaotic presence to obscure itself. The wind was so loud that every small movement made me jump. I remember thinking about how the weather data was going to be off the charts, but I couldn't even focus on that. I started shouting to myself, something along the lines of, "It's just a bird, it has to be." But I couldn't fully convince myself. I kept thinking about the stories I'd hear from the local employees, or the Coast Guard guys who occasionally pass through. People talk about strange sightings in the Aleutians, but I always chalked it up to boredom or local legends. They'd mention voices in the wind, silhouettes that dog the coastline at night. I'd mentally file all that under folklore. Now I'm standing there in a downpour, hearing the rumbling thunder, seeing flashes of green lightning, which we do get occasionally due to atmospheric conditions out here, and witnessing something that just doesn't line up with anything I've seen in any field guide or avian reference. Suddenly, there was a break in the storm, one of those quick lulls where the wind dies for a few seconds. I caught a full, unobstructed look of the wings as it glided over the station. They weren't feathered. They seemed more leathery, almost like a giant bat, but the shape of the body was distinctly humanoid. The movement was smooth yet unsettling, like it wasn't affected by the wind at all. It just soared in a slow circle above me. Then the thunder cracked so loud it shook my ribcage. In that flash of lightning, it seemed to fold its wings and drop beyond the ridge behind the station, where the hills sloped down towards Clam Lagoon. I was absolutely drenched, and my heart was running a marathon in my chest. For a moment, I considered heading inside and locking the doors, like that would do anything against a creature that could just tear the roof off if it wanted to. But I refused to just hide without confirming it was gone. When I finally forced myself to follow where it had dropped, I saw nothing, just the swirling sheets of rain and the silhouette of distant mountains under the storm clouds. I must have stood at the fence line for another 10 minutes, scanning the sky, waiting to catch another glimpse. Nothing. It just disappeared as quickly as it appeared. I ended up running a full diagnostic on our exterior cameras after that. We do have thermal imaging, but the system had some weird glitch right around 0:11 a.m., lasting until 0:17, which might coincide with the sighting window. It recorded a lot of static and distortions, but I can't say for sure if that's normal for such a severe storm, or if something was interfering with it. I've looked at all the archive footage, and the only evidence is a flicker of something large crossing one of the camera's fields of view at 0 hours, 12 minutes, and 45 seconds. But it's so grainy and muddled by the weather that it's impossible to decipher a shape. Since that night, I haven't seen it again, but the uneasy feeling still lingers. I checked local chatter, and there haven't been any open reports of strange sightings in the area. Most folks here are more concerned with the fishing season and the supply shipments. I almost brought it up to one of the older guys in town. He's been in a DAC since the 80s, back when the Navy base was operational. But I stopped myself because I'm not sure if revealing I've seen something like this might kill my credibility. As a meteorologist, I'm supposed to be the grounded one in the room, you know? Still, it's gnawing at me. I keep replaying that image in my mind, those massive wings gliding overhead, the way it seemed all too aware of my presence. I can't think of any logical explanation for a winged humanoid figure, large enough to be visible in a storm, ignoring the fierce gusts and seemingly floating with ease. I've been thinking about local beliefs or cryptid sightings. People talk about thunderbirds in some parts of Alaska, but that's typically described as a giant bird, not a humanoid. Yet there's a persistent sense that I glimpsed something that doesn't belong in any scientific record I know of. I don't want to jump to conclusions or sensationalize it, but the memory of seeing it is so vivid, it makes the hairs on my arms stand up whenever I recall it. You can imagine how it feels being alone out here at night, with the wind knocking branches or ice chunks against the siding. Every flash of movement in my peripheral vision gets my adrenaline pumping. I don't really know what else to say, except that this was one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. If I hadn't stepped outside right then, I would have chalked those perimeter triggers up to a faulty sensor and never been the wiser. If you decide to share this story on your YouTube channel, just keep in mind this is from someone who spent years studying weather patterns and atmospheric phenomena. I know storms, I know how wind interacts with moving objects. This was beyond anything I can reconcile with the normal or the natural. Been sitting on this for a while, and I'm still not sure if I'll regret sending it. Spent the better part of July and August out near Holbrook, Arizona. Officially, I was there to poke around the old Holbrook meteorite-strewn field. Folks have been collecting pieces there for over a century, ever since that well-documented fall back in 1912. But honestly, I wasn't just there for Holbrook. I'd heard about a possible new fall, some small crater-like impressions cropping up in the desert, which was weird on its own. You don't typically see brand new impact sites outside of large, well-reported events, let alone a cluster of them. Got out there mid-July, right when the monsoon rains were starting to roll in. If you've never smelled the creosote in the high desert after a rain, you're missing something downright biblical. Anyway, I was picking my way through the brush, just a few clicks outside the city limits, when I noticed these shallow depressions. They looked too uniform to be random, peppered across maybe a half-mile stretch of scrubland near a dry wash. There were about 5 or 6 in total. At first, I half figured them to be just sinkholes, or where a rancher might have done some hasty digging for something. But then the edges caught my eye. They had that weird scorched look you sometimes see in meteor impact pits, like the dirt's been seared with a blowtorch. I've collected micrometeorites around Canyon Diablo near Meteor Crater, and that scorching can be a dead giveaway. So I squatted down in one crater and started testing the looseness of the soil with my hand trowel, looking for fragments. Found a few black flecks. Not the typical iron nickel you'd expect, though. These almost looked metallic, but under the loupe, they had a slight glassy sheen. That's not unheard of, especially if there's some fusion crust involved. I still wasn't 10% sure. I bagged them up, labeled the spot, and moved on. It wasn't until I was on my second crater, deeper than the first, that I realized the strangest thing. The edges of the crater walls had a swirl pattern, like you'd taken wet sand and twisted it. That's unusual for a meteor impact, unless there's a high explosion or bizarre angle. And that's when I noticed a smell, vaguely sulfuric, but not exactly. More like ozone or burnt plastic. Went into town that evening. Ended up chatting with one of the locals. I won't call him by name, but he's known for telling stories about the old route 66 days. Indirectly, he let slip that around the time these mini craters popped up. A bunch of folks reported unusual lights in the sky. That's hardly shocking for Arizona. Lots of us remember the Phoenix lights back in '97, so UFO sightings around here are old hat. But apparently these lights were more localized. People spotted them specifically over the desert east of Holbrook. Big bright orbs that zipped around and vanished. And then, a few nights later, folks heard strange booms, like muffled thunder with no storm in sight. That's exactly when I'd expect a meteor fall. But usually it's a single event, not multiple craters scattered around. Something else about my talk with that local stuck with me. He mentioned seeing lights hovering real low, and dare I say it, he also implied that these weren't standard aircraft or meteor fireballs. Didn't call them UFOs outright, but the insinuation was clear enough. I chalked it up to overactive imagination at first, but the next day I took a drive closer to the Painted Desert region, near the boundary of the Painted Desert Indian Center on I-40. There's a long stretch of scrub and rolling mesas where the sky just stretches on forever. I like to set up my metal detector in these wide open spaces. I found 2 more fresh depressions out there, smaller, but with the same swirling soil pattern, same blackish residue. I started to wonder if these might be something other than meteorites. You know how it goes once you get a hunch. Your mind won't stop spinning. I ended up contacting a buddy of mine from Flagstaff, who's got ties to the local university's geology department. Indirectly, he pointed me to a rumor that some within the department had been collecting fragments from these so-called impact craters for the past week. Now that might be normal. Geologists love new falls if that's what this is. But I got the impression there was a hush-hush vibe, like they'd been asked or told not to talk about it openly. No official statements, just a quiet collection mission. He told me secondhand that some of the fragments seemed manufactured, which is crazy talk. Meteorites are natural, unless we're dealing with space junk. And even then, you'd typically see evidence of welding or man-made alloys. Possibly it's satellite debris, but who knows? At that point, I was half convinced something bigger was at play. There's a certain rancher off Little Lithidendron Wash. I only know him because I've scoured for fragments near his land before. When I drove up to ask if he'd seen anything, he didn't answer the door but hollered through the window that I should mind my own business. He said he'd had folks on his property a few days prior, wearing what he described as government-looking trucks with no labels. That's his phrase. He heard them milling around the property at night, scanning the ground with handheld devices. He told me indirectly through the window, we never made eye contact, that they collected something off the ground, but they left no sign of who they were or what they took away. He basically told me he doesn't want any more trouble. I actually felt sorry for him. He seemed genuinely spooked. I took a break from searching, maybe 4 or 5 days, and that's when I started having weird dreams. I've never been the type to let the stories get under my skin, but something was gnawing at me. I'd dream I was out there in the desert, kneeling by those craters under a full moon, and then I'd feel static in the air. I'd look up and see not just 1 or 2 lights, but dozens, fanning out in a geometric pattern across the sky. I'd wake up with my heart pounding. Normally, I'd blame it on listening to too many UFO-themed podcasts, but I hadn't listened to anything for months. It felt tied to everything I'd been seeing. When I finally mustered the nerve to go back, I took the back roads near Joseph City, scanning for any other suspicious depressions. Sure enough, just before sunset, I spotted what looked like another crater about the size of my car's hood. Same blackish residue, same swirling pattern. But guess what? The surrounding brush looked flattened in a circle about 20 yards wide, like a crop circle but in desert scrub. Couldn't make heads or tails of it. There were no footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. I poked around for an hour before it got too dark, found a few more flecks of that glassy metal, bagged them, labeled them, and started feeling that same uneasy sense of being watched. Might have just been the approaching darkness and the knowledge I was alone in no man's land, but it felt different, like I was intruding on something. Found out a few days later that my buddy from the geology department no longer wanted to talk about it. He gave me a quick excuse, something about departmental funding. That's a euphemism I recognize. Probably means they got encouraged to keep quiet. And it wouldn't surprise me if some official group is trying to keep these findings under wraps, especially if they think these might be UFO related. It's not the first time I've heard areas get discreetly cordoned off after weird sightings. It's just that usually it happens in more remote spots, like the Uinta Basin in Utah, famous for all the Skinwalker Ranch stories. But this is central Arizona, near well-trafficked areas along I-40, and it's happening under our noses. The strangest part is, I haven't seen any big news coverage, any official analysis of these impacts. If it were a straightforward meteorite fall, you'd see local stations or at least some minor articles. The only chatter I've found is from folks on a UFO forum, describing the bright orbs in the sky. A few mention hearing a crackling noise overhead, followed by seeing a flash on the ground. One person claimed they saw what looked like a diamond-shaped craft descending briefly, then shooting off in a blur. Unfortunately, that's all anecdotal, but it lines up suspiciously well with these crater sightings. People keep telling me I'm chasing a rabbit hole, reading too much into normal geological occurrences. But I can't ignore the swirl, the scorch marks, the strange metal flecks, and I definitely can't ignore the hush-up vibe. Around the time I was packing up my campsite near Painted Desert, I swear a black SUV drove by 3 times on the same stretch, seemingly just scanning the area. I didn't see any plates on it. Could have been a rancher, could have been a tourist, but I've got enough experience out there to know that was abnormal. I do plan to analyze the fragments I grabbed. There's a private lab in Tucson that might run a test without asking too many questions. Might not be cheap, but I need to know if I'm onto something. If it turns out they're just bits of iron nickel or basalt, I'll have to eat my words. But if there's an undiscovered alloy, or some anomaly that doesn't match known meteorites or typical earthly material, That'll confirm my worst suspicions. Even if I never get official confirmation that these are linked to UFOs, I'll know in my gut there's more to this story. I'm not even sure how to start this because my head is still spinning from everything I've read. I'm hoping you can make sense of it on your YouTube channel because I'm completely overwhelmed. But I also feel that if I don't get this information out there, it's going to die with me. This all started when I was asked to sort through some of the older records at a local historical society here in Knoxville, Tennessee. I'm a volunteer archivist and self-taught historian, mostly focusing on local Civil War-era diaries, personal letters, and church registries. That's my comfort zone. But what I stumbled on this time completely shattered the normal pattern I'm used to. So the other day, I was in one of those dimly lit storage rooms behind the display of old city tax registers from the early 1900s. I had set out to reorganize some of the mislabeled boxes that had been piling up in the corner. One of them was an old wooden trunk, the type with the tarnished brass edges. I almost didn't bother opening it because it didn't look like the standard cardboard repositories the society typically uses, and at first, I assumed it was some personal donation that hadn't been officially processed. But curiosity got the best of me, and I ended up cracking it open anyway. Inside, I found several diaries bound together with a thick, dry-rotted leather strap. The diaries were dated from 1950 all the way through to 1967, with a few single pages from 1949 tucked in. I remember feeling that strange tingle you get when you realize you might be holding something that's never been read in decades. That sense of connection to the past. The diaries belonged to a man named Daniel Brooks, who, according to property records I looked up later, apparently lived in a modest farmhouse south of Maryville, near the old Alcoa Highway. That area's changed a bunch over time, so I was curious if the house even still existed. Anyway, this Daniel Brooks wrote with a shaky hand, but he was very detailed, meticulously so. His earliest entries were the usual recipes, notes on weather, some local news about the economy, random mundane things like how his neighbor's daughter was going off to Memphis for nursing school. But then, around late 1951, something shifts dramatically in his tone. He starts talking about hearing large wings flapping over his barn at night, and about seeing figures perched along the roof edges that would disappear whenever he tried to shine a flashlight at them. He wrote things like, "They come during the half moon, always after midnight, can't figure out what they want." I thought for sure it was some kind of local legend or a leftover from a lurid rumor about giant owls. But the intensity and detail of his descriptions made it seem like he had no reason to lie in a private journal. Then it gets more bizarre. In mid-1952, he wrote about two men in black suits with no official insignia who came by one afternoon asking about strange bird activity on his property. He never says FBI or CIA. He just says Gov't men. He noted that they looked more like accountants than law enforcement, but they had a commanding presence. These men apparently told him he needed to keep all his observations to himself, for the sake of public safety. Then they gave him their contact card and left. He never mentions what was on that card, which frustrates me, but he harps on how the feeling of that conversation left him uneasy. He writes, "I think they know more than they're saying. Why would they want me to hush about birds?" It goes on. The diaries shift between normal everyday commentary on the farm equipment he was repairing, or the sermons he heard at church, to praising God one moment, then ranting about winged creatures the next. The key entry that blew my mind was from October 1953. He describes a silent shape gliding above his barn roof and landing near the silo. He claims it stood about 6 feet tall, with membrane-type wings folded downward. He uses the phrase "like a dark cloak," and he thought it might be a giant bat or some unknown species. He goes on in a shaky scrawl about feeling paralyzed by fear. By the time he musters the courage to investigate, the thing is gone, leaving scratch marks in the dirt. He even drew a rough sketch that's barely more than a silhouette with elongated limbs. Let me make a side note here. I occasionally write articles about local legends and have come across my fair share of weird sightings. I mean, East Tennessee has the Bell Witch stories over near Adams, And we've got all kinds of cryptid tales floating around. But I've never seen something so consistent across multiple diary entries. This Daniel Brooks documented each subsequent sighting in detail, time-stamping them in the middle of these entries about normal life. It looks absolutely authentic, not at all like someone writing a fictional account. Sometimes he'd go weeks without referencing it. Then out of nowhere, you'd see a frantic entry about how someone else spotted the torso with dark wings flying near the orchard. By 1955, these diaries mention more government officials coming onto his land. He never calls them by name, just says they're from the air base further south, which I suspect could be a reference to the Arnold Air Force Base, or possibly the old McGee-Tyson-related facility in Knoxville. He said they installed some kind of recording device on his property. He was told it's for weather tracking, but they apparently demanded that he not speak to neighbors about any unusual sightings. To me, it sounds a whole lot like they were monitoring these winged entities and trying to keep a lid on it. What sets me on edge is how he remarks that local law enforcement was also in on it. He wrote about how the Blount County Sheriff's deputy visited him, not to check on him but to remind him he didn't see anything out of the ordinary. As if that wasn't odd enough, there's an entry in 1957 where Daniel scribbles something about a rumor he heard from a friend who worked at Oak Ridge. That's the secret city from the Manhattan Project era, for context. This friend supposedly told him about recovered anomalies in the mountains, and how certain federal agencies were actively covering stuff up by labeling it top secret. Daniel goes off on a tangent about how the government is testing or hiding these winged creatures. At one point, he references project, and the rest of the line is scratched out, so I can't make sense of it. It's all very hush-hush and incomplete, but reading it made my palms sweat. I realize it might sound crazy. Diaries from an old Tennessee farmer talking about winged humanoids and cover-ups. But these diaries feel genuine in every sense. The paper is aged exactly as you'd expect. The penmanship changes over the years like you see when someone gets older. The realm of details about daily life and the local store closings all check out with known records from that period. If it was a hoax, it's way too elaborate, and there's no reason for him to hide it in a trunk that probably nobody would open for decades. I became downright obsessed with these diaries for a couple weeks. I even drove out to the approximate location to see if any part of Daniel Brooks's farmhouse remains. The entire area is subdivided now with new developments, so I couldn't find a standing structure that matched old property descriptions. At the Historical Society, I came across a property map from 1960, and there was indeed a farmhouse in that area. But apparently, it was abandoned after a fire in the early 70s. Interestingly, there's a short newspaper notice from 1971 about an unexplained barn fire south of Alcoa Highway. Could be pure coincidence, but I couldn't help making the connection. Anyway, while rummaging through the diaries, somewhere around 1963, he stops writing about the winged beings altogether. No mention of sightings for nearly a year. Then, in April 1964, there's an entry where he writes something like, "They caged them or tried to. Government told me it's all resolved." Don't think that's true. It's super cryptic. The phrase "they caged them" is circled 3 times. And the final mention comes in 1967, where he references hearing rumors that the Dark Watchers were spotted in the Smoky Mountains by hikers, but officials didn't want it in the local papers. That's the last entry he wrote about them. Everything after is mundane chatter about his declining health. The diaries abruptly end in late 1967. I don't know if he passed away then or just stopped writing. I asked a friend of mine who's more into cryptid research, and he said it's reminiscent of a Mothman-type phenomena, but we're talking 2 decades before the famous Point Pleasant sightings. The timelines don't perfectly match any well-documented winged humanoid accounts, and that's what makes me think there's more to it. Either it's a completely separate phenomenon that never got big media coverage, or it's something the government successfully squashed and kept from the public. The diaries certainly suggest that a full-blown cover-up was orchestrated. And if these diaries are accurate, it means that at least a handful of local officials, and maybe some nearby Air Force bases, were actively involved in controlling the narrative. I've tried scanning a few pages on my own scanner at home, but the paper is incredibly fragile. I'm debating whether to approach the local university's archival department for help, but I'm also a bit concerned about the diaries getting lost if I turn them over to official channels. It's not that I don't trust them, I've worked with them a lot, but I also know how these things sometimes disappear when they become politically inconvenient or sensitive. There's no chance the diaries themselves are publicly cataloged yet, so they're still off the radar for the time being. I might look into whether any longtime residents remember hearing strange stories from that neighborhood. But from what I've gathered so far, there's no mention in local newspapers about winged creatures. No references in the sheriff's log. Nothing. It's like everything Daniel described was systematically kept quiet. Honestly, reading his accounts put me on edge for weeks. Every time I heard a whooshing noise outside at night, I'd start imagining something perched on my roof. It's easy to laugh at it until you realize how deliberate the suppression of these events may have been. Why would the government or military go to such lengths if it was just a giant bat or a trick of the light?